set me thinking about a number of things. You ask about Paul's use of kind of Jewish literature and that sort of thing, especially wisdom literature in Romans 1. And that's rather obvious for anybody who knows something about the wisdom of Solomon uh, book in the Apocrypha. But it also set me back into some research that I had done on Paul's use of the word glory and the verb, of course, glorification or glorify. Um, the Greek word is doxa. It's a simple word. Sometimes it's translated uh, as though it means just how other people see you, your reputation, that kind of thing. But when it's attached to God, it's something really special. And we saw in Romans 1 that Paul talked about people glorifying the creation instead of the creator. And that glorification, he said, they exchanged the glory of God for the glory of creatures on earth. That kind of use of glory isn't unusual for Paul. In fact, it comes up several other times in the book of Romans, and that's just the first time it comes up. He uses it again when he gets into chapter 3, when he's talking really about what we call salvation, what he calls justification. But verses 21 and following, now apart from the law, the righteousness of God has been disclosed and is attested by the law and the prophets, the righteousness of God through faith or faithfulness of Jesus Christ for all who believe. For there is no distinction, since all have sinned and, in most translations, fall short of the glory of God. I was puzzled by that and a number of other texts, but to fall short of the glory, the verb there could actually mean lack the glory of God, and I think that might be a better translation, because Paul would have been aware of some retellings of the Garden of Eden, fall of Adam and Eve stories, that we have some of them in writing in the old Apocalypse of Moses, in what is called the life of Adam and Eve. We have Eve succumbing to Satan's temptation and eating of the fruit of the tree of knowledge of good and evil. And then immediately in that retelling of the story, immediately she says, "What have you done? You've stolen the glory with which I was created." Glory, that's kind of an odd thing to say. And then a few verses later, she gives the fruit to Adam and he eats of it and says exactly the same thing. "You've stolen the glory with which I was created." And later on, God comes back to them and assures them that he's going to restore their glory. Well, what does all that mean? For one thing, there are some fantastic descriptions in Jewish literature of Adam, and one of them has him so big that he's got one foot on one continent and another foot on another continent. And the stars are circling around his head, and light is coming from him, which is one way to understand glory. And all of a sudden, because of their disobedience of God, he's whatever 5'5" and no more real glory. And so there's something in Jewish literature about this word glory that is more than just the glory of God. It's the glory by which God has created certain people and things. It comes up in 1 Corinthians when Paul talks about the glory of the celestial and the glory of the terrestrial, and the glory of the sun is one thing and the glory of the moon is another, and so forth. It's really kind of odd the way he describes all of that. And then in that verse in 3, that we lack the glory of God, feeds into chapter 5 in Romans, where in the second verse, might as well start, do 1 and 2. Therefore, since we are justified by faith, we have peace with God through our Lord Jesus Christ, through whom we have obtained access to this grace in which we stand, and we boast in our hope of sharing the glory of God. Sharing the glory of God. Interesting kind of hope that we can share the glory of God. And then in chapter 8, he comes back to it again. Starting at verse 18 of Romans 8, he says, I consider that the sufferings of this present time are not worth comparing with the glory about to be revealed to us. For the creation waits with eager longing for the revealing of the children of God. For the creation was subjected to futility, not of its own will, but by the will of the one who subjected it, in hope that the creation itself will be set free from its bondage to decay and will obtain the freedom of the glory of the children of God. Once again, glory is part of the ultimate salvation of people. And neat segue, in Colossians, the first chapter, in verse 27, to them, to the saints, Christians, believers, and so forth, to them, God chose to make known how great among the Gentiles are the riches of the glory of this mystery, which is Christ in you, the hope of glory. So he uses it twice in that one sentence in relationship to our salvation, our ultimate salvation, the hope of the glory. That's one of those themes, and there are other texts we could look at too, but one of those themes out of the Jewish creation story and the fall of Adam and Eve, it seems to me that Paul picks up and uses quite often in relationship to this this thing we call salvation. What we're going to be freed from. Other places he contrasts death and life, and other kinds of contrast, darkness and light. But we're going to be freed from this lack of the glory of God, which he talks about in the 3rd chapter of Romans. And so here it is again in Colossians. And Colossians, of course, is a different kind of setting too. When he's writing to the Romans, he's writing to people a few people he knows, but for the most part, he hasn't met the Christians in Rome. He hasn't visited Rome itself. He wants to do that, but hasn't been there yet. So he sort of has to be a little careful about how he says things, it seems to me, and he's setting out a lot of stuff that he hopes they'll understand. In Colossians, he's writing to people that he's quite well acquainted with, and in a church that he helped to start and has been had a relationship with before, so he can kind of skip a lot of the niceties in Colossians. But something has happened in Colossae since he was there, and it looks as though, from what he is saying in Colossians, that somebody has been trying to introduce things that would supplement somehow the gospel that he's been preaching. And he wants them to know that Christ is everything. They don't need anything else. They don't need some kind of philosophy. He talks about the wisdom and philosophies He talks about special days and seasons and so forth. He talks about the worship of angels at one point, and all of this in negativity. He doesn't want them to be involved in all of that because they already have everything they need in Christ. And it seems to me that the so-called Christ hymn in verses 15 to 20 is the kind of starting place for all of that argument that he's going to make in this book of Colossians. And I think it should be helpful to us to compare what he says about Christ and creation here to what he has said about God and creation in Romans 1 and elsewhere, and also what Luke says he said to the Athenians, to the philosophers, about God and creation. So in verse 14, he kind of gets into this, 13 and 14. Christ has rescued us from the power of darkness and transferred us into the kingdom of his, God has, of his beloved Son, in whom we have redemption, the forgiveness of sins. He then, this is the Son of God that he's talking about. He is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn of all creation. For in him all things in heaven and on earth were created, things visible and invisible, whether thrones or dominions or rulers or powers, all things have been created through him and for him. He himself is before all things, and in him all things hold together. He is the head of the body, the church. He is the beginning, the firstborn from the dead, so that he might come to have first place in everything. For in him all the fullness of God was pleased to dwell, and through him God was pleased to reconcile to himself all things, whether on earth or in heaven, by making peace through the blood of his cross. So here's Paul talking about the Son of God, Christ the Son of God, in relationship to creation, which means in relationship to everything. The word all or every is repeated. It sounds almost redundant after a while as you read it. It's even more visible, it seems to me, in the Greek, where pan, ta panta, pasa, all these forms of all and every just come up over and over again. I've underlined them in one translate, or in the Greek, actually. You can see it in the 15th verse. He is firstborn of all creation. In the 16th verse, for in him all things in heaven and on earth were created. And then on down in the 16th verse, all things have been created through him and for him. 17, he himself is before all things. In him all things hold together. In verse 18, toward the end, so that he might come to have first place in all things, everything. And then 19, in him all the fullness of God was pleased to dwell, and through him God was pleased to reconcile to himself all things, over and over and over again, all things, all created things, which means the earth and the heavens and we human beings, all is due to Christ's work, and all is under the aegis, under the sovereignty of the Son of God, our Lord Jesus Christ. So once again, he uses creation as a kind of starting point for this argument about the, the fact that Christ is enough, that they don't need anything else to sort of supplement Christ. They don't need rituals. They don't need the special times and seasons. They don't need a special vocabulary. They don't, need other kinds of objects to worship, like angels and so forth. Christ is enough. Christ is all in all, as he puts it in other places. So it seems to me that at least what caught my attention this time through the first chapter of Colossians is that that term "all." It's all in Christ, and and He's all we need, and that's what Paul's trying to get across to the Colossians. They don't need to add stuff to Christ. We don't know exactly what kinds of philosophy and religious things were being pushed on the Colossians at that point. It's interesting to read. Any two commentaries you read on Colossians are going to disagree about that. It seems like, and there's an old cartoon that I think of every once in a while. A preacher having books all over his desk, getting ready for his Sunday morning sermon, and saying, "Oh, good, the commentators disagree, so I can be creative." We have to watch that creativity stuff, but it seems to me that Paul does say in many different ways. So Christ is all we need. He's in charge of everything that's going on. And I'll let Tim do the preaching later, but it seems to me that we need to hear that once in a while. Rosemary says, "Why are we so tired when we're not doing anything?" Well, we are doing some things, but part of it, I think, is just kind of emotional wearing down in this period. We all have our concerns. George would like to see his granddaughter. We'd like to see Robert. So many people want to travel and want to hug people, and we're just frustrated because it's out of our control. And that control thing it seems to me, is what Paul is getting at here, to a certain extent, at least, that anytime we try to add something to Christ, even if it's adding our own understandings or our own strength or our own wisdom, we get into trouble. And it's hard for us to sit back and say, He's got this. But it seems like we all need to wear T-shirts that say something like that. Christ, the power of God and the wisdom of God, He's got this, and in Him we have the hope of glory. Christ in you, he said, the hope of glory. And that means that He's getting us ready for the restoration of whatever glory it was that God created into human beings that we lost. And again, we talk about the image of God in Genesis, but it seems to me that the later Jewish thinkers sort of started to substitute glory for the image. That we lack the glory of God. Something has happened to damage the image of God in us. And Christ is the image of God, he says, right at the beginning of this Christ hymn. And He is the one who is in charge. And as the old saying goes, God is God and I am not.
Bruce?
Yeah, John?
I was struggling. I'm giving the communion meditation and focused in on the passage of John, which talks a lot about glory and glorification. Do we have an English word or concept that approximates what they're talking about in the New Testament? It seems in a way that idea of glory or glorification isn't something that pops up very often in conversations that I have with people.
To answer your question, no, I don't think we have a single idea or word that would translate that, because it has such a broad meaning, and you almost have to understand the context in which it's used to understand its meaning. But as I say, it's one thing when it talks about God and something else, and when it talks about human beings, and Paul talks about the glory of the sun and the moon and stars and so forth. It's beyond my understanding, at least. Anybody else have some wisdom?
Let me just add one thing, and that is, I do think that in John, glory is very similar to what Bruce is saying, very Jewish, as opposed to kind of the standard Greek meaning of glory, which oftentimes had the idea of one's reputation or something like that. But glorification is interesting, John, because glorification not only is what Jesus somehow does to God, he glorifies God, but John uses it later on in the gospel as kind of one of his substitute words for the crucifixion. His crucifixion.
Wow, I was going to ask that question. That passage, that's what I had come to think, that somehow the glorification is Jesus on the cross. That's
his substitute word. He uses it. It's time for me to be glorified, and what he means is time for him to die, to be crucified. And so he uses it in this really interesting, and that's really purely Johannine, where he uses the verbal form, glorify, as somehow something about him dying on the cross is going to give him glory, reflect the glory of God, but also to glorify God. So every time that he talks about him being glorified, it also talks about him glorifying God.
Yeah, it works both ways.
In some ways, it seems in John that glory is the godness of Jesus. We have seen his glory, the glory as of God's one and only Son. And so where you see Jesus' godness the most is in the crucifixion.
Mm-hmm.
Can I add one other thing, Bruce? Just
Sure.
a footnote to your Old Testament references, because I've read that once or twice. And that is, as soon as you started talking about this, especially from the later Jewish reflection on it, I thought of Psalm 8. You have made them just a little lower than God and crowned them with glory and honor. And that may well be the source of some of that Jewish reflection. So now you've caused me to go back and read some of those pseudepigraphal books. And in Job 40, the second time God addresses Job, and I'm convinced Job, the author of Job, knows Psalm 8 specifically, as he's kind of challenging Job, who's just shut up and refuses to speak. God says, adorn yourself with splendor and majesty, clothe yourself with honor and esteem. And often that's read to mean, okay, I'm going to put you in the position of God and you figure out if you can do what I do. I think it means take up your proper role as a human being made in the image of God. That's where I'd link that image of God language that you suggest the glory language is playing with, and assume the role you were meant to have as a human being made in the image of God, to have the role human beings were to have. And so very much so that glory language I think we have in these two passages that is very similar to what you're talking about here.
Yes, and it's connected to creation in the 19th Psalm. The heavens are telling the glory of God.
Bruce?
Barry?
It seems like, in a number of places in the Bible, glory is sort of visualized as a bright and, incredibly shining light. It seems to me that underlies a lot of the usages of the word glory in the Bible, that you visualize you know, a God surrounded by this incredibly bright, blinding light, which actually reveals and conceals God at the same time. But I don't know where that association first began with the word glory and light, but it's definitely there.
I would suspect, am I on?
Yes.
I would suspect, I'm not sure chronologically, but canonically in the Exodus story of Moses going on the mountain and his face shining, you have that language there. You also have the glory of the Lord as that sort of tangibly experienced presence of God, filling the tabernacle in Exodus 40, filling the temple in 1 Kings 8, and then Ezekiel sees the glory of the Lord leaving the temple in Ezekiel 10 and 11, and then in the visions of restoration at the end of Ezekiel, you have the glory of the Lord returning from the east and filling the new temple once again in Ezekiel 43.
Is that all kavod?
Yeah.
Hebrew word.
You know, I was thinking it's sometimes words are hard to classify as nouns, verbs, or adjectives, and glory is one of those. I think we even in English we use it. We glory in something, or glory is considered an adjective, or there is the glory of the Lord. It almost anytime you find it used, it's slippery. If you're an old English major, a major of old English, I guess, but it almost seems like it can be used in one place as all three. It's descriptive, it's a state of being, it's an action. That's a fascinating word.
Yeah. And in that Romans 8 passage where Paul talks about the whole creation, looking forward to the freedom of the glory of the children of God, that sometimes is translated or mistranslated glorious freedom. And I guess the freedom would be glorious, but that's not what Paul says. He uses different nouns there, and glory is a noun in the genitive case. It's the glory, is the freedom of the glory of the children of God. It's an odd kind of construction, but the freedom looks like freedom is something that sort of comes from the restored glory to us who believe as we enter that ultimate kingdom of God.
Bruce, you know, your comment there in Romans 8 made me think. I've noticed this becoming a pattern, especially in NIV and some of the other translations, that those genitive clauses are frequently turned into adjectives or adverbs, and it really it's not the same thing. They really kind of change the meaning, potential meaning, in an effort to make something sound more Englishy, flowing. Those genitive change genitive descriptions are frequently changed now.
Yeah. And Paul uses strings of possessives like that quite often, so they get mistranslated, as you say, to smooth out the English. But he's pretty clear in that passage, it seems to me. You know, once I got a hold of the idea that glory is connected somehow to creation, that's something that we lack, as he says in the 3rd chapter, that we hope for in the 5th chapter, and that we in the whole creation look forward to in the 8th chapter. He sort of builds that picture of glory, beginning in chapter 1, where we exchange the glory of God for the glory of created stuff. And so it's a fascinating study, and I'm glad you brought in the Gospel of John, because it's all over there, too.
Which John are we? Okay, which John
Yes.
are we talking about? Okay.
Bruce, I wonder if we may not have time, but I wonder if
Could I make a brief statement? It looks like Zoom had a big update, and it looks like I no longer have a 40-minute. We seem to have a more unlimited one. I'm not getting any notices and I looked at my login. So I'm going to plan on us going till about 9:55, but
Great.
it doesn't seem like it's ending anytime soon. So go
That's
ahead,
the
Barry.
glory. That's the glory of
Thanks,
Zoom. It's
I wonder, Bruce, if you would want to comment on the fact that in several of the passages you've read, the glory or obtaining the glory seems to be, a hope. It's, it's what we receive at the end. But in 1 Corinthians 11, I wonder how Paul reconciled the idea that in 1 Corinthians 11, he says that the male, not the man, but the male is in the glory of God, and it was created in the glory of God. The female, however, was created in the glory of man, where it seems like it's a completely different idea, because it seems to be a present possession as opposed to a hope. The male is created in the glory of God, and therefore should not wear a covering over his head. And then the woman is created in the glory of the male. I wonder if you thought about that.
No.
Yes.
Thought about that.
Yeah.
Written by men.
I guess I will now, but I haven't thought about it.
I don't see that the woman is.
It seems like a very different kind of. It seems to be thinking in two completely different ways. I can't hardly see the link between the two.
Yeah, that's why I said it has such a broad range of applications, this word glory, and especially in the New Testament, but I think probably in the Old Testament too, that you really have to look closely at the context in which it appears in order to understand whether it's just reputation, just a kind of a brilliant light, as you say, or something internal, or it's really hard, and some of it is, as I say, kind of beyond me. It looks almost as though you've got different amounts of glory. So, does that make sense? We have a certain amount of glory now, but we're really going to be getting a whole lot of it later. I don't know whether that makes sense or not, but there are some of the places that I've been looking at, especially in Romans, seems to say we've got some now, but not all of it, and ultimately we'll have it. Let's see, there's another place in Romans 8 that glory comes in. I can't see it right now, but and of course he comes back to creation at the end of Romans 8. But anyhow, it looks like there is a kind of a general use of glory in the sense of the best of human life or something like that. But then there's also this glory of God and this freedom of the glory of the children of God that we look forward to. So, you have to look at the context. You've done enough exegesis teaching to appreciate that.
it seems in that.
Bruce and Barry, on that, I don't have an answer, by the way, on 1 Corinthians 11 at all. So, except to say that NRSV decides to translate glory as reflection and just kind of different. So the woman is the reflection of the male. It's rid of that kind of glory language. But that passage from 1 Corinthians, Bruce, that you cited earlier about the stars have a certain glory and the sun has a certain glory, and such on. You know, the end of that is that we're going to be, our resurrection, we're going to be raised in glory.
Right.
It is sown in dishonor, it is raised in glory.
Glory.
But what's interesting is towards the end of that resurrection passage, he then also shifts the terminology and talks about, just as we've borne the image of the man of dust, we will also bear the image of the
The
man
image,
of heaven. And now all of a sudden shift the icon to this issue of image language. And it
Right.
seems like he's using image and glory
Mm-hmm.
almost interchangeably,
Some-
which
yeah.
does come back to the 1 Corinthians 11 issue. Because in the
Yeah.
first part of that 1 Corinthians 11, he talks about the image and glory of God. Man is created in the image and glory of God.
Mhm.
So something's going on with that cluster of words.
Yeah, that's why I connected glory and image in Colossians with Christ as the image of God and the hope of glory. Yeah, it's complicated.
Yeah. What's hard to figure out is exactly, how Paul conceived of the female's glory. Whether he regarded it as God's glory reflected off of the male, but not directly, because he does make a sharp distinction. This is a part of his argument about why the male should not cover his head, because it exudes the glory of God, and the woman's head exudes the glory of man. So therefore, her head should be covered.
It makes you think that he's playing off of Genesis 2 as opposed to Genesis 1.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
Well, would you be interested, Barry, in picking that up and teaching a series?
You want the short answer?
We didn't get the unmuted answer, but I can imagine.
I volunteered for 4 weeks, and this is number 4. So
Barry could do 1 Corinthians 11 and then shift to 1 Timothy, the women's passage there. We could kind of chain our way through those. Go, Barry.
Church of Christ background, he knows plenty of the arguments about women.
He even wrote some of it in that collection from a collection of essays. So
Yeah, the Osborne book. Yeah.
So he knows everything. That's
yeah.
No.
she knows everything.
I was completely humiliated yesterday because I was talking to a lady on the phone at a florist in my mother's hometown. And I ordered the flowers, and then she asked me, "What do you want to say on the card?" And so we said, "Happy Mother's Day with all our love." And I said,
And she asked them about the name.
"Oh yeah," she asked about the names. And I said, "Well, Barry and Kathy Blackburn." And she just started dying laughing in the background.
This was for the card.
This was for the card to go on the flowers. And she said, "I don't think Blackburn is probably needed."
Your mother probably knows your name.
So I, of course, this lady could hear Kathy laughing hysterically in the background, so I had to explain what happened.
So sometimes knowledge in part is a good thing. But seriously, before we sign off, somebody ought to be lined up to do something for the next few weeks.
Well, I would be willing to lead a discussion. I'm not sure I want to do it on that topic.
Not that topic. Let's do something else. But if Barry's willing to, Barry can think about something that might be a good discussion.
Yeah, choose your topic, Barry.
Yeah, we're fine with that.
as long as it's not 1 Corinthians 11, 1 Timothy 2. Is that what you're saying?
Choose it carefully.
Yeah, I'm just not sure that would be very edifying. So what if I send out an email in 2 or 3 days and let you know what I settled on?
Yeah.
That's fine.
Yeah,
Surprise
that's
us.
great.
Yeah.
Great. That's good.
Good.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
I like the 9
Right.
keep it time. How do y'all like it?
Yeah, 9 a.m.'s good.
It's,
for
it's,
me.
We
it's,
can make it.
it's much better for us.
Good.
Yeah.
Good. Yeah.
It doesn't break the day up as much. Not that we
Yeah.
have a ton of stuff to do, but if you do, it was trying
Speak
to
for
get
yourself.
I can
Breaks
get back to
my
my
day
Sunday
up.
afternoon nap too.
There you go.
Yes.
Let's do
Let
that.
me break in real quickly. Kathy
That would
Banks,
be a,
let me know when you got some plants, when you're digging outside, okay?
Let me see if I can unmute
There's
you.
Mark.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yeah, I can hear
Okay.
you now.
Any time is probably fine now that it's not pouring the rain. So
Yeah, okay. But I might give you a call and come over this evening or something like that.
that'd be fine.
Okay.
And I'm making sandwich bread today that I have some extra loaves that are not yet claimed. So if anyone's interested, you can email me.
Okay.
John, where are you getting your flour?
Oh, I already had some, but I went to Sam's
Sam's has plenty.
a month ago and they had restocked we buy it in the big
Aldi,
bag.
I haven't had any problem finding flour. Aldi's got flour. Lots of people have flour. So
What about rye?
Fresh Market had it at the end of every aisle, Rosemary said.
Yeah.
Wow.
Oh.
Okay.
Rye,
Yeah,
I don't know
some of
about
you try to
rye.
get the wrong
I
kind.
haven't found it.
it's not a question of finding flour, it's finding flour that will be the glory of bread.
That's true. That's an excellent point.
I don't know. Maybe it's the yeast that brings the glory.
Well, I'm getting ready to try and I sent a box to Grace, and the day after I sent it, France refused packages, and I didn't know that, and it finally came back to me after about 5 weeks.
With
I got the box
brownies.
back.
With brownies.
Yeah.
And so,
How
yes,
were
with
they?
the brownies, which were illegal, but anyway, I'm now going to it's supposed to reopen the mail tomorrow, international mail. I'm not going to send it till I know that that's true. But John and I bought a 2-pound bag of flour because Grace has not seen flour in 2 months. And she can't find that. It hasn't been in the stores, in her store, in 2 months. So we're going to try. We'll see what happens.
This, I tell you, meeting by Zoom, it's still not the best thing to meeting in person. Boy, we're having trouble with cabin fever. This is just wonderful. to get
Yeah,
together
it
on
is.
Yeah,
Zoom.
it is good. This has been good.
Yeah, it really has.
All right.
All right. Thank you.
We'll see y'all later.
See you
Have
later.
fun at church.
Goodbye.
Bye-bye.
Right.
All right.
Good night.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.